Hello everyone, it's Dev to Dev, the podcast about everyday video game developers and why they do what they do every day. Back with another themes episode in this hiatus between Season 2 and Season 3. I know I said there was going to be a themes episode last week, but holiday and various things meant it was easier to re-release an episode. An excellent episode, I think, with Bill. I really enjoyed re-listening to. I hope you all did too. This week, a slightly delayed episode again because of the holiday. Just got back on the weekend. This week's episode is the theme of what it costs, trying to highlight through some of the folks that have been kind enough to lend their time to the podcast in Season 2, focusing on some of the personal cost of being a game developer. We start with Mark Acero, who gives some really interesting insight into anxiety and some of the challenges that the stress of crunch on some previous work has cost him, even to the point where he discovered he was having panic attacks that he didn't realize he was having because he felt he'd always handled stress well, and it turned out he wasn't. I think that's some good insight there. Following up with Scott Nisenfeld, some insight into crunch, as well as some of the challenges of the recent layoff that he and I were both a part of at ZeniMax, and some of the challenges he's found losing his job and not having anything to go to for the first time in his career. I thought there was some really good insight there. Next, we have Nathan Kelman back again with some more insight into layoffs, how he'd just been handed his first real level design role, and then shortly after found out the project that work was going to be on got cancelled, and the challenges of navigating that. And closing with Brian Kindrigan, who opens up about some of the challenges of living in Edmonton to pursue the job that he loved, but at the cost of his first marriage, and how that affected his view on video game development over time and how he's navigated that subsequently. And also some good insight into the challenges of being a narrative director and what that role means, especially across cultures. So I hope you enjoy this collection of snippets from Season 2. If you haven't already heard these conversations, please go and listen to them. I think they're excellent. I'm really proud of Season 2. I think we got some really great insights, some good personal discussion, and covering some elements that people don't really talk about, the challenges of making video games, both good and bad. I don't want to imply that Season 2 is all negative and a load of people are grumpy about it. Far from it. But I think there is some, I think this episode sort of tries to poke a little bit at that thread of, hey, it's not all fun and games making video games, and doing something you love, can be tough when it maybe doesn't go as the way you hope it will. As always, Dev to Dev is on Patreon. Thank you for my most recent subscribers. Again, if you want to check out all of Season 1, which the last 2 weeks have been re-highlighting, the archive of Season 1 is only for patrons. Please check that out, as well as the video versions of all of Season 2. And when Season 3 drops, Season 2 will move into that archive, so the value of Patreon will only increase. I've been on a few podcasts recently. I'm excited to be guesting on the Level Design Lobby very soon, recording that tomorrow. Very excited about that. I hope that will be released soon. That should be a fun conversation. But in the meantime, as I've mentioned, discovery is my hardest barrier, so if you could spend some time telling someone that you think might enjoy it, reposting and sharing any of the clips and the episodes that I shared, really appreciate that. But anyway, enough of me waffling. Let's sit back and listen in to another episode of Dev to Dev, this time focusing on the theme of what it costs.
Funny thing is, it was also around the same time Eminem, Lose Yourself came out. So that was like my theme song as I was crunching late at night. You only live once. When opportunity knocks, you got it. I won't butcher the song. All that together was like, I'm going to put my heart and soul into this because I want this to be my career. And that was before EA Spouse. And so there was times when I was crunching, I was literally working 120 hours a week. I had a little fold out bed. I'd work until really late at night, fall asleep, wake up, get back to working again, go home for lunch and shower or eat. But that's what I was doing back then because that's what I wanted to do. Because it was Golden Axe, which I played a ton in the arcade, that's what I nerded out on. And I really appreciated that studio because now there's some articles about Crazy Crunch or some of the antics that we did at that studio. But the director who hired me told me, hey, we had a bunch of juniors. Production went longer than we'd like. We got rid of the juniors and now we're only hiring senior people to help fix a mess. So we're going to crunch and I want you to know that up front. I appreciate it. He told me I'm going to inherit a mess and it's going to be some hours. And so I was ready for it and, was ready to work. I was getting older then. At that point, I was married, and my first was born during the time that I was at that studio. Because of all the production issues, scope had to be cut back a lot. So my role, I was the designer in charge of all the beasts that you ride and even fight against. Well, obviously, it's a big part of the game and gameplay. So we were intending for mocap to cover all of our humans. So a lot of our hand animators, they were going to get to focus on the beast and the boss fights, since obviously giant proportions of enemies and creatures. Story for another day, or there's an article out there if you want to read it. But things happened where the footage from the mocap shoot wasn't usable. I think it was like 2 animators whose job was intended to convert the mocap and to make it into usable assets. But it was determined that it was far faster to just make an animation from scratch than to convert what footage was taken. So all my hand animators that was supposed to work with me on beast and bosses, all hands on deck. And now, because of course we need all our humanoid animation since you're playing as Tyrus Flare. So that dramatically cut a scope of what we had intended to do for the game. There's times I've definitely looked back on, I know I was being taken advantage of. Even if I'm in a studio, if I don't feel like I'm appreciated, then that has made me start to look elsewhere. Actually, I think there's only one project where I didn't finish it to the end before moving on. And that's how bad it was. How else did it harm me? Well, mental health. I was having crazy anxiety attacks. Even when I was first diagnosed as anxiety attacks, I didn't believe the doctor because I'm like, what? I've always handled stress well. What are you talking about? Because I have a heart murmur as well. So I thought it was all related to my heart. But he's like, no, these are symptoms of anxiety. And he explained to me what it is and why. And sure enough, after I left that location, I was happy. I wasn't having anxiety attacks anymore. Yeah, it was a very toxic environment. I went there because I was told, oh no, we believe in empowerment. And the same guy who told me you can make decisions was also the same boss that micromanaged me the most in my life. Like every little thing was overlooked on, and like it was really crazy. So yeah, I have suffered health-wise because of some locations where we're nuts.
Pretty much after graduate school, I spent the next 4 years trying to get into the game industry through all the wrong methods, not realizing the exact kind of good ways of getting your foot in or finding the right website to apply through. But in 2007, or 2006, I lucked into working for a year for a company that was making what I would describe mostly as basically a college MMO. They wanted to do kind of like a virtual campus, but I think they were also about 10 years too early. This was something that probably would have taken off right when the coronavirus kind of kicked in and everything. But I came in with that, and the first thing they wanted to do was to integrate Lua into their system. And so I had never heard of Lua, the scripting language, before, but later realized that I had had run-ins with it because playing Monkey Island and the Lua bar being a reference. And so picking that up and integrating it into this existing MMO system they had built on top of Gamebryo, it was really a kind of trial by fire in kind of like learning how to, number one, integrate it into the system, number two, having to write things so that people who weren't programmers could script out interactions in the world and whatnot. And then also having all this over a networked connection just throws another spanner in the works when you're doing all that. Yeah, it was very much like basically getting that scripting system set up and running for them. And then towards the tail end, it was ripping out and replacing the audio system they had. Yeah, it was a very small team, and yeah, it was just a very interesting project for sure.
And how did it feel to kind of land that first? You'd taken you 4 years to land it, and then you got your foot in the door. How did that feel?
It felt very good, and like, hey, I can finally start to use this, all this information in my head, and I can start applying it, and I can start, just having a real world experience with it. Because there's a lot that you learn in school about this stuff, but the development side, the actual like processes that you have to go through for development aren't ever really brought to you. Like there is no, like, you're handed projects in school and you do them. And here it's like, okay, we have this incremental step on something that we need in a week or two. We need to get on it, and we need to work with these 2 other people to do it. And it's like, okay. And that first job was also completely remote. So it was just a real kind of, it felt weird because I just go down to my basement where I'd always gone to just play video games, but now I was, working during the day. After about a year, the project at Proton Media, they had to have some reductions, and so I got laid off. But I kind of, with that knowledge and that under my feet, was able to kind of take off running again. And Breakaway, which is a local studio in Baltimore, they just had an opening for an engineer, and I applied and came in, and they asked some weird questions to me about movement on spheres, and I was like, that's an odd thing to talk about, and was lucky enough to land kind of a junior or just a gameplay engineer working on what I found out to be the expansion for Command and Conquer 3. The company had previously worked with EA on the Rise of the Witch King expansion for Battle for Middle-earth 2, which had gone over very well for them. And they were told at the time that the engine they were working on, the Sage 2 engine that had been running, that this was the last game that was going to be using that engine. And so they could go wild with it. Well, and then a year later, Command & Conquer 3 comes out using the same engine, and they were approached again to work on the expansion pack for that. And they were told that this was going to be the last game running on this engine. And so it was very interesting getting into that code and seeing a lot of stuff that was very hard-coded and a lot of variables of is Army of the Dead, which you're just like, that's an interesting variable to have in a kind of an engine that's supposed to be, very flexible and modifiable. It sounds like, you could see a lot of the code just basically of, well, the last project, we can just do this and we don't have to worry about it. That project did not go as well. We were working for EA LA. They're on the West Coast and we're on the East Coast. And so we'd get about halfway through our day before they would start having questions and comments on stuff we were doing. And because this was fully owned by EA, they had a lot more demands on how they wanted it to end up to being. And they tried running us as an internal version of EA, and changes had made to the engine of that game so that data builds would take about 3 hours. And so while you could slice in like data changes for designers, as an engineer, if you made any changes to any of the underlying data structures of the game, you had to completely rebuild the data. And so we ended up getting 2 PCs in our cubes at this point, so that when we were doing a data build on one, we could work on problems on the other one. We ended up having way more units that has ever been added to an expansion to a game ever before. We were adding this world conquest mode, which was one of the things I was brought in to work on. And I was hived off with an artist and a designer to kind of prototype out and work on it initially, of just how you were going to do this giant world. And at first they were thinking of doing a globe that you would spin around kind of XCOM style, but we just couldn't figure a good way of doing that in engine, because the engine was made basically for, RTSs. And so we ended up just kind of working on the RTS map and working on and tweaking on that. And over the year of production, it took slower than they liked, and they were going to pull it at one point, and then it was in, then it was out, it was in. They pulled it for the Xbox 360 version, so it was in on the PC. It was just a lot of kind of back and forth on it, and kind of, it didn't get the love it needed, the final version that came out. I was told by basically the senior guys on staff, they're like, this is the worst experience we've ever had working on a project. And it's like, if you've made it through this, you've made it through the hell of development. A lot of late nights, extra weekends, a typical industry version of crunch. And luckily, since then, that's the only time I've ever had like basically 8 months of crunch on a project. It's always a disappointment, because there's always the glimmer of this could, for a lot of the projects, you see what the end goal is, and you're like, that is going to be really interesting. And the point you are at right when it's canceled, you're like, well, I can see the steps it's going to take to get there. And you just give us a couple more, months and whatnot. We'll really show you something really spectacular. That one really hurt because not only was it canceled, but the whole team was let go. And previous times when I had been moved on to projects that was canceled, I got rolled back onto existing project. And so this was the first time in 12, 14 plus years that I'd actually was out looking for a job again. Like before, I had a steady job when I was looking to kind of change. And so the double shock of that, and just everyone else being laid off, and the fact that this interesting project that we were working on just wasn't going to see the light of day, really hurt. you're told make what you love your job and you never work a day in your life, but at the same time, what you love to do then becomes kind of work. The hardest time of the layoff was the fact that I didn't have something to work on during the day and just feeling aimless, and even trying to start up and do small self projects. It didn't have the same kind of grab to me. And a lot of the times it just would suffer from scope creep of just like, well, let me just tinker around and do this small little thing. Well, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to do this. And so working at a company really provides a nice, good, steady environment for me that I feel like I flourish in and work well in. And that, yeah, this is what I do, and I like doing what I do, and I'm happy that I'm able to do what I do, because I'm sure I could find, if push comes to shove, I'm sure I could pivot to something else, but I really would be missing working on games and watching people's reactions to the stuff that I make, and knowing that when someone does something and they're like, oh, look what I did, I'm like, I had all hand in that.
Yeah, so with Hangar 13, what happened was I came in there around June, then around November, the game we're working on got canceled. And then around that time, there was a lot of different shifts and things that were happening. And probably 6 months later is when we had like a big layoff. So essentially with Hangar 13, they had 3 or 4 studios around the world. And the one that I was working for was in Nevada and San Francisco. And essentially everyone in the Nevada office got let go. But luckily enough for me, and this is so crazy, my friend Kyle was working at Lost Boys Interactive. And for about 6 months, he was trying to convince me to go work there with him. And I was like, no, I like where I'm at Hangar 13. I think I'm good. And then probably I would say a month before the layoffs happened, I was like, okay, you know what, Kyle, fine, just give him my resume. I'll talk to him. And I did an interview with the recruiter, and they actually told me at the time, if you get hired, you'll be working on Diablo 4. And I was like, oh, that's kind of like a really big deal. And then, yeah, I didn't hear from them for about a month, and then the layoff happened. And then I emailed them, and they said, yeah, we actually want to do another interview with you. So I think the layoff happened that Monday, and by the Friday, I had an offer from Lost Boys. When that happened, I remember people looking at me like, how the hell you get a job so fast? But I was already in the process, and then that's when my journey with Lost Boys started.
Right. So, I mean, it sounds like you landed on your feet out of the layoff, but
yeah,
having landed your first professional role, you're doing it, right? You're doing the dream, and then something gets shut down, the project gets cancelled. Like, how did that feel, and how did you process that?
Man, I mean, it was crazy because I remember I had a meeting with my lead and the senior that day, and it was when they were just about to give me my first task where I was going to block out my own level by myself, because before I was working on different levels already blocked out or putting in objects. So this when they were like, hey, we want to give you your first level, you are going to block this out. And I remember being so excited. And then probably an hour after that meeting, we got an email from our CEO saying the project got it canceled. And I remember thinking to myself, like, wait, so do I keep working on stuff? Do I not? What do I do? And it was, I mean, yeah, it was pretty panicky for people, because people were like, are we getting laid off? Is the studio shutting down? What's happening? So a lot of people were rightfully so scared. And I think some people kept working on the project a little bit, but I mean, I just kind of was like, well, I'm just going to stop myself. So we ended up having a meeting with CEO. He started telling us like, hey, we have some things in the works. I think around the time too, that was when Mafia All Country was in super early pre-production. So I ended up being on that for a couple of months, where I did some really basic prototyping, because it was hard, because the one thing about with pre-production, especially on a new project, is like juniors really aren't needed on pre-production that much, because seniors and principals and leaders trying to figure out, okay, what are we making? Because usually juniors come on when, hey, we're making this, can you help us execute that? But for me, I was just given tasks, and then Lee was trying to get me onto another project within the studio, but then that game got canceled. So we had like 2 games get canceled span like 2 months. But yeah, I mean, it was hard, it was crazy, but I think for me it was a huge lesson to understand that at the end of the day, the game industry is a business, and if the numbers don't make sense, then things are going to happen. So I had Lost Boys, actually, the project we were on had gone and shelved. And at that time, too, a lot of studios were doing layoffs. I think it was that 1 week where Riot and Activision and Blizzard all have major layoffs that week. And because we do code development, we were talking to people, but I think at that time, nobody was looking for code dev, because we don't need to pay a studio X amount of money when we just laid off like a whole team. So it was difficult for us at that time, because also Lost Boys were under the Embracer Group. And so when that whole Embracer thing kind of went off, so when that all happened, even the projects that they had that we're thinking we're going to get put on, those are all getting canceled or studios are getting sold off too. I remember because we had a layoff at Lost Boys, I remember messaging the studio designer. He said, man, we just couldn't find work. We were looking for work for months. And he said up to the last day, we were trying to find a studio to work with, and just nobody at the time was looking for help for code dev. And that was a big thing because you would think that code dev is safer, but definitely with how the industry was at the time, if no one's hiring anybody, it really doesn't matter. So after Lost Boys, I worked at a place called S02 for about 6 weeks. And because when the layoff happened, a friend of mine, I knew him from Michigan State because he was an alumni there. He was kind of mentor to me. And he was actually part of a startup. And the person who was a CEO and founder, I also kind of knew her because when I got laid off at Hangar 13, one of the guys, his name is Vance, he was game designer at Hangar 13 at the time. And when he saw I got laid off, he was like, hey, I have a friend of mine. Here's her LinkedIn. Message her right now. She's going to try to help you. And she actually years later became the CEO of this company, S02. When they saw I got laid off, they were like, hey, we really want you to come onto our project and help us out with some things level design-wise. So, of course, I'm like, well, yeah, sure, I would love to. And I was there for about 6 weeks. And during that time, I was talking to Escape Velocity. And the way Escape Velocity happened was the associate design director was my previous lead at Hangar 13. Lost Boys having a layoff, I reached out to him. I was like, hey, I'm looking for a job. Do you guys have anything? He said, actually, we actually about to start looking for a level designer. We'd love to interview you. And I think because I knew so many people from Hangar 13, when they heard the news, a lot of them were looking out for me when all that happened. So I was at S02 for about 6 weeks, and I got offered a full-time job at Escape Velocity. No, S02, they really wanted me to stay there. I told them, I love you guys, but this is a contract position, and I know they were looking for a publisher. I can't hang my hat on hoping you get something when there's a studio that has a full-time offer for me. And they understood that for sure. So I ended up going to be Escape Velocity, and I got brought on as an associate because for them they felt like my skill sets weren't there yet for mid-level, which at first I was kind of like, but what do you mean? But then when I came onto the project, I started learning like, okay, I'm not ready to be mid yet. Now I'm mid-level, and now I feel more prepared to say that I'm mid-level, but every studio is different, especially with Escape Velocity. So many of them have worked in AAA for so long that in their minds, mid-level is a different thing than Lost Boys had, right? I've been blessed with that, the fact that my connections are able to help me get the jobs, especially in times of need, for sure.
BioWare wanted me to move to Edmonton, Alberta, which is extremely far north. I mean, I had served in an extreme cold weather unit in the Army. I had no problem with the cold, although my then wife did. But yeah, we moved up to Edmonton, and I loved the work. So I was writing on Jade Empire, which was one of the last games for the very first generation of Xbox. And it was just this amazing feeling of coming into work every day and doing something that I love, which was writing dialogue or coming up with stories and talking with people about that. And I enjoyed it a lot. I had a lot of fun. Towards the end of my time on Jade Empire, when I probably would have rolled on to Dragon Age Origins, I think, Hollywood came a-knocking and offered me a job as a supervising director on an animated TV show for, I want to say, triple what I was making at BioWare. And I had spent all that time as a storyboard artist, and I did the thing that everyone does, I think, where you look at the director and you go, yeah, he or she's okay. They kind of could do these 5 things better. And I was like, oh, this is my chance. So I went back. I moved back to LA, went back to Hollywood, directed the show, and almost immediately was like, I've made a mistake. Yes, I'm making a lot more money and I'm getting to direct, but I don't enjoy this. This is not what I want to be doing. I remember showing up to work on Jade Empire and just loving the actual thing that you do for, let's say, 70% of your day, right? But after a few years of going, maybe I should go back to games, the guy who'd been my boss on Jade Empire, Drew Karpyshyn, he was the lead writer, he emailed me. I don't know. I don't remember how things worked back then. I'm nearly sure he didn't call me because we didn't quite have cell phones yet. Anyway, he contacted me and he said, hey, we're just about to ship this game called Mass Effect, and we're starting up on 2, and I really need you to come back. I need you on Mass Effect 2. And I was like, all right, this is it. This is what I wanted. So I went back to games to write on Mass Effect 2 at BioWare in Edmonton. And after that, I have been in games, consistently.
Got it. While you were back being directors, did you try and get back into games?
I did talk to Drew briefly when I heard that BioWare was starting up a studio in Austin. So I want to say this is around 2004, 2005. I was like, well, I did hate living in Edmonton And please, if you're from Edmonton and you want to send hate my way, please don't. I'm not saying it's a bad place. I'm saying it wasn't for me. And it wasn't the cold either. It was some other things about the lifestyle there. But I thought, hey, maybe moving to Austin. So I remember I kind of talked to Drew a little bit. He put me in touch with some of the people in Austin. They were a new division starting up. And I got the sense that they were a little like, you're kind of like an Edmonton guy, which I did not see myself as. And so there was like a brief interaction, but there was not a lot of interest. So other than that, no, I really just focused on film and finding my next gig in film and continuing to pursue that until Drew really like sort of did the full court press to get me to come back, which I was thrilled by. It's not like, I don't want to make it sound like he was twisting my arm.
No, it sounds like it was an offer you couldn't refuse. But it's just fascinating to me. It's almost like you'd gone back to something you trusted but didn't enjoy. I don't know, maybe I'm reaching here, but maybe you didn't think you'd get that chance again.
Yeah, I think there was a couple factors. I think that was a part of it. I think also that the only contacts I had in games at that time were all in Edmonton. So in my mind, going back to games meant moving back to Edmonton, which was just not, it had contributed to the end of my first marriage, and so I was not super excited to do that. And then honestly, the money was a part of it at that time. When I first went to work on Jade Empire, I took a huge pay cut. When I went back to film, as I said, my salary tripled. And, I don't make decisions based purely on the money, but you do got to pay your bills and so my first experience had been that I had to really sort of downgrade my life a little bit in games. And one of the things that happened in the intervening years while I was back in film is that game compensation sort of caught up to film. There was a combination of things. There was, the financial side of going back to games started to look better. I was really impressed by Mass Effect 1, so I really wanted to work on 2. And for that, and that did involve moving back to Edmonton. And I was in a new relationship at the time, and that period of living in Edmonton actually damaged that relationship as well, although we survived it and we're still together and we're happily married. So all of that made it more tenable. But certainly on the more sort of wistful side, I agree. I do think that I thought I had a shot at happiness and I'd kind of bungled it. And I was like, well, I guess I just got to stick with what I know.
Yeah, I think those are both really important factors that a lot of people maybe don't think about for us developers, right? Is the relationship impact of maybe doing a job that you love, maybe working heavy hours in a place that maybe, is more about the job than it is about the location, and the compensation. Like you say, everyone has to pay bills, everyone has to live. So sometimes the right role for the wrong money just doesn't work as much as it might be a dream role. And I think those are realities that we all face, at different times, different points of our career.
Yeah. I remember when I was a young storyboard artist, there were these older, more experienced board artists who would always say stuff to me like, never take a job just for the money. And I'd always think, okay, you say that, but you have a 4-bedroom house in Burbank and I'm living in a 1-bedroom apartment in North Hollywood, which for those who don't know LA, like Burbank, North Hollywood in terms of safety, infrastructure. And so I was always like, well, that's easy for you to say. But I do think, at a very high conceptual level, that is true. I think if you take a job just for the money, then you should go back in time and become like a brain surgeon or a lawyer or something, or some other job that you may not enjoy, but you would make a lot of money. The choices that you made that led you to this creative career, you absolutely, as a person in the world, you have to consider finances and your financial future and outlook and blah, 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 all that. But like, you shouldn't extract or remove the creative fulfillment part of your consideration for the job, because that's why you're here. When I left Blizzard, there were no narrative directors there. I think it came around because of some bigger teams, like at Ubisoft, for instance, where the teams get quite large. You end up just needing a director-level person to be the champion of the narrative at that level. They do very little direct narrative work. It's more organizational. But I had already started to kind of realize that if there are narrative directors out there, I need to become one defensively, because there comes the point, this is a really big realization I had about working as a creative. There comes the point where you should not accept another promotion, right? Because you get into something that you love, like say writing, because you love doing it. And then you get promoted to like lead, and now you still do writing, but you're also doing one-on-ones with people and going to resource allocation meetings and all this. And eventually, and this is what happened to me on the TV show that I directed, if you accept too many promotions, you find that you're not doing any of the thing that you loved and a bunch of stuff that you don't love, right? So when I first started to hear about narrative director, I was like, is that something I want to deal with? But this is the part two of what I just said, is that you also need to rise high enough that you don't find yourself constantly subjugating the stuff that you know how to do really well to someone who knows how to do it less well, right? So in other words, if I end up as a lead writer working for a narrative director who doesn't have a really strong narrative background, and there are some out there, right? Then every day will be an exercise in saying, hey, I think we should do it this way, and then being told, no, we're going to do it that way, and me being like, okay. So as a creative, you have to find this weird range where, like, you don't go too high, but you're also high enough up in the food chain to kind of, like, you know, do the thing that you know how to do really well, right? And as you know, game development is all compromise, so you still won't get most of what you want, right? But at least you have a voice at the table. So I realized narrative director was something I should pursue. And yeah, I had a couple friends that had left Blizzard to go to Epic, and they were having a great time there, and Epic seemed really interested in me. So yeah, so I went there. At first, it was not that different from lead writer because Epic also had never had a narrative director. So me and Epic together were defining what it was. But yeah, it was a great experience. It was a very different culture because if BioWare and Blizzard are tech companies that make games, Epic is much more tech company that makes games that will demonstrate how good its tech is. And it's just a very different approach to things. It's not a better or worse approach. But yeah, I had a lot of revelations, a lot of lessons learned. That's not code for bad experiences. That just means as soon as I said that, I was like, oh, that sounds bad. Yeah, I feel like learned a lot of new things and had a really good time. Yeah, so the thing that brought that on was a confluence of events. It's very interesting times. So the project that I was on at Ubisoft, which I really believed in, was an unannounced game. We ended up getting canceled, not, at least this is what they told me, and I believe it, not through any failure on our part. It was just a thing where we were still early on. We were in the conception phase. But to give you a sense of the scale of Ubisoft, we had 100 programmers on our team, right? So we were in conception, and there were multiple other projects that were struggling, and the decision was just made to cannibalize our team, right? Shut our project down, disperse us to other teams that really needed us. And I was asked to move. There was another project that I was asked to move to. But at the same time, that happened in December 2019. So I was in Montreal. My wife was still in LA working down here. And I was like, oh, I think the world's going to end. So I actually am going to move back to LA so I can, you know, when the nukes fall and the disease comes, I can be in my house with my wife. So, you know, I had already had a relationship with this studio, NetEase, which is one of the biggest developers in China. I'm trying to remember how that relationship started. Part of it was working on Reaper of Souls.
I was going to say, was it Diablo? Yeah.
Published our game in China. And I had gone over there and given talks a few times, and we had a great relationship. And they wanted me to come over and sort of help some of their Chinese game teams learn more about global development, how to think globally in terms of the way they approach their projects. And so a part of that was, you know, there's the writer part of me, there's the middle manager, I guess, part of me. And then the other part, you know, I mentioned I used to teach, right? And so I've always enjoyed teaching and mentoring. And if you haven't guessed from this video, I enjoy lecturing, apparently. And so that seemed really interesting. And they were totally fine with me working from LA. So I did that. The title change was so that if I went to a game team in China and said, like, hey, you need to do things differently, I sort of showed up with the credential on paper to tell them that kind of thing. And B, the title creative director is a really strange one in games because it means something wildly different at every studio I've worked at. And what I find interesting about that is I work with some people who know one definition from their studio, and they're always kind of like begin conversations with the assumption that it means this or that, right? I would say the way they use creative director at Blizzard now, these days, they didn't have them when you and I worked there, but they do now, is really more like a narrative director, right? The way they use it at Ubisoft is more like a game systems director. You know, it's like much crunchier. And I've seen many different variations of it. So to me, it's a good title because I can sort of show up and say, look, this is the stuff I'm good at. This is the other stuff that I'm not an expert in, but I have informed opinions and can discuss intelligently, you know, and all of that fits under the umbrella creative director. So a lot of lessons learned. I think that one thing I really value from that experience is the level of communication that you need. You're dealing with people that speak a different language, but also have a very different culture. And then everything you say is being filtered through a translator who might be excellent. This is not a criticism of the translators, but there's no way around it. Everything you say is going to get kind of flattened down. And so I've learned a lot of techniques for making sure my communication is clear and crisp and concise, and I repeat the important points. It's a lot of stuff that actually I can take from that and apply to people who have the same language as me and benefit from it.
Well, that's it, folks. Thanks for listening in. I hope you enjoyed these little snippets from Season 2. I think that theme of what it costs is really fascinating, and although there's plenty of other clips I could have pulled, I thought these were some good ones that really zeroed in on that challenge. As mentioned at the intro, thank you for everyone that listens. Thank you for the likes and shares. Please continue to do that. Next week will be another revisit of an episode from Season 1. I continue to work on Season 3 in the background. Excited for this episode. I'm not going to spoil it. I'm going to let you discover it next week. It's a really good one that I'm excited to reshare. One that, although I was finding my feet, I'm super proud of. So again, thank you to everyone that listens. Thank you to everyone that shares. Please continue to do so. In the meantime, catch you next time.